Easy one. I mean, you're saying that it's a possibility that if a school has a club for Vietnamese American students or Black students where they meet after school, that they could be potentially in jeopardy of receiving federal funding?
Again, I would like to fully understand what that order is and what those clubs are doing.
President Trump's executive order targeting DEI programs left schools across America asking one question: what exactly counts as DEI? During her confirmation hearing, Education Secretary Linda McMahon faced repeated questions from Senator Chris Murphy, who pressed her on whether schools could lose federal funding over Black History Month, African American history classes, or student cultural clubs.
I want to talk to you about an executive order that the Trump administration issued that commands agencies, including the Department of Education, to eliminate grants to organizations and entities that support DEI programs and activities. As you know, this has a lot of schools all across the country scrambling because they have no idea what that means. They don't know because the order doesn't define DEI as to whether they are in compliance or out of compliance and whether they are going to have their federal grants compromised. How does a school know whether it's running a DEI program or not?
Well, certainly, and thank you, Senator, and it is good to see you again outside of the state of Connecticut, where we run into each other. DEI, I think, has been, it's a program that's tough. It was put in place ostensibly for more diversity, for equity and inclusion, and I think what we're seeing is that it's having an opposite effect. We are getting back to more segregating of our schools instead of having more inclusion in our schools. When there are DEI programs that say that Black students need separate graduation ceremonies or Hispanics need separate ceremonies, we are not achieving what we wanted to achieve with inclusion.
Let me give you an example then. So this order applies to Department of Defense schools, and those schools have canceled all programming around Black History Month. So if a school in Connecticut celebrates Martin Luther King Day and has a series of events and programming teaching about Black history, are they in violation of a policy that says schools should stop running DEI programs?
Not in my view. That is clearly not the case. The celebration of Martin Luther King Day and Black History Month should be celebrated throughout all of our schools. I believe that Martin Luther King was one of the strongest proponents of making sure that we look at all of our populations when he said that, he would hope that his children wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. And I think that is the fundamental basis that we should celebrate Black History Month.
West Point has closed down all ethnic clubs, so the Society of Black Engineers no longer can meet because they believe that to be in compliance with this order, they cannot have groups structured around ethnic or racial affiliations. Would schools, would public schools be in violation of this order? Would they risk funding if they had clubs that students could belong to based on their racial or ethnic identity?
Well, I certainly today don't want to address, hypothetical situations. I would like, once I'm confirmed, to get in and assess these programs, look at what has been covered.
That's a pretty easy one. I mean, you're saying that it's a possibility that if a school has a club for Vietnamese American students or Black students where they meet after school, that they could be potentially in jeopardy of receiving federal funding?
Again, I would like to fully understand what that order is and what those clubs are doing.
That's pretty chilling. I think schools all around the country are going to hear that. What about educational programming centered around specific ethnic and racial experiences? My son is in a public school. He takes a class called African American History. If you're running an African American history class, could you perhaps be in violation of this court order, of this executive order?
I'm not quite certain, and I'd like to look into it further and get back to you on that.
So there's a possibility, you're saying, that public schools that run African American history classes, right? This is a class that has been taught in public schools for decades, could lose federal funding if they continue to teach African American history.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I would like to take a look at these programs and fully understand the breadth of the executive order and get back to you on that.
I think you're going to have a lot of educators and a lot of principals and administrators scrambling right now.
Less than 3 weeks after this confirmation hearing, the U.S. Senate confirmed Linda McMahon as Secretary of Education on March 3, 2025. After taking office, she immediately began carrying out the Trump administration's education agenda, including efforts to reduce the federal role in education, review diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives, and implement executive orders affecting schools and universities. In the months that followed, the Department of Education issued additional guidance on DEI-related policies, while multiple states, universities, and education organizations challenged parts of the administration's directives in federal court. Those legal disputes continued as judges considered whether some aspects of the policies were sufficiently clear and consistent with existing civil rights law. Those developments make this confirmation exchange particularly significant because Senator Chris Murphy's questions focused on an issue that educators across the country were trying to answer. How should schools interpret the administration's new DEI policy before detailed guidance had been issued? Murphy argued that schools, colleges, and local education officials were left in an uncertain position because the executive order directed agencies to eliminate support for certain DEI programs without clearly defining what activities would fall under that label. To demonstrate his concern, he cited examples familiar to many public schools, including Black History Month celebrations, Martin Luther King Jr. Day programs, African American history classes, and student organizations centered on shared cultural backgrounds. Rather than giving definitive yes or no answers, Linda McMahon repeatedly said she wanted to review the executive order and evaluate specific programs before determining how the Department of Education would interpret and enforce the policy if confirmed. She emphasized that she supported celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day and Black History Month, while also expressing concern that some DEI initiatives, in her view, had moved away from inclusion and towards separating students by race or ethnicity. That difference in approach became the central point of the exchange. Murphy argued that uncertainty alone could have serious consequences. If school districts could not determine whether ordinary educational activities might jeopardize federal funding, administrators might cancel programs simply to avoid potential violations. He repeatedly pressed McMahon to clarify whether schools teaching African American history or allowing cultural student organizations would remain eligible for federal funding under the executive order. McMahon responded that she was not suggesting those specific examples violated the policy. Instead, she maintained that responsible enforcement required reviewing the full scope of the executive order and the details of individual programs before reaching conclusions. Throughout the hearing, she declined to speculate about hypothetical situations, saying she preferred to make those decisions only after assuming office. It is important to distinguish between the executive order itself and the legal questions surrounding its implementation. The executive orders directed federal agencies to review DEI-related programs, but they did not automatically prohibit every classroom discussion of race, history, or culture. How those directives would ultimately affect schools depended on later guidance issued by the Department of Education, as well as the outcome of ongoing litigation in the federal courts. Looking back, this hearing foreshadowed many of the debates that followed McMahon's confirmation. Questions raised by Senator Murphy about federal funding, classroom instruction, student organizations, and the practical meaning of DEI remained central as schools adapted to new federal guidance and courts reviewed challenges to the administration's education policies. That is why this exchange remains relevant today. It captured the uncertainty surrounding a major policy shift before those rules were fully implemented, making it an early preview of a national debate that continued long after the confirmation hearing concluded.